In the early morning hours of March the 18th, the fragile truce in Gaza came to a violent end. In a wave of airstrikes reminiscent of the early days of Israel's shock offensive in late 2023, IDF warplanes laid waste to targets all across the Gaza Strip. At last count, as the time of writing, more than 400 people have been recorded dead, with more bodies almost certainly trapped under rubble, and minimally equipped hospitals overwhelmed with the injured. The proportion of civilian casualties is not yet known. The ceasefire that might have put an end to the Israel-Hamas war ended up lasting just shy of 2 months. Now, as smoke rises over Gaza once again, it appears that the notion of peace is just as far away as it's ever been. For better or for worse, and let's be clear here, almost certainly for worse, the Israel-Hamas war is back on. Here's what you need to know at a moment when all roads seem as if they lead to ruin. The attack was dubbed Operation Might and Sword, and when it kicked off at approximately 2:20 in the morning local time, the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, set their crosshairs on a population that was already on the brink. Many people were already awake by the time the bombs began to fall, preparing suhoor, the early morning meal consumed before sunrise during the ongoing Ramadan fast. Choked by a complete cut-off of humanitarian aid and forced to ration what little remained, the coming weeks had already seemed as if they'd be exceptionally difficult for Gaza's civilian population. In fact, it was widely expected across much of the territory that the ceasefire with Israel was already doomed to failure, and that the violence would begin again in earnest very soon. But in a war already defined by frequent and intense attacks from the air, Israel's surprise raids still managed to stun and horrify the world. According to information available at the time of writing, at sundown on Tuesday the 18th, local time in Gaza, the Israeli military hit at least 35 separate target areas via airstrikes. Those targets spanned all up and down the Gaza Strip, from Gaza City in the north to Rafah in the south, and many were pounded continuously, with witnesses on the ground reporting explosions every few seconds, lasting up to hours at a time in multiple locations. According to the IDF, the targets consisted of locations where mid-level Hamas commanders and Gazan high-level officials were located, as well as Hamas infrastructure. Said the IDF about its target list in a joint statement with Israel's domestic intelligence agency Shin Bet, quote, "The targets struck over the past few hours include terrorist cells, launch posts, weapons stockpiles, and additional military infrastructure used by these terror organizations to plan and execute attacks against Israeli civilians and IDF soldiers." The quote ends. During the strikes, Israeli officials also indicated that Hamas attacks had been judged to be imminent, and that the Israeli attack was thus a preemptive action to stop any attacks from taking place. On the ground, however, reports flooding out of Gaza indicate practically unanimously that the strikes destroyed far more than just Hamas infrastructure. According to Palestinian civil authorities, who, to be clear, operate under Hamas leadership, but whose accounts generally go on to be verified by third parties, numerous strikes were reported in refugee camps or neighborhoods that were already heavily damaged, offering little protection, and a whole added element of danger from easier building collapses for those forced to try and live in the rubble. Several residential buildings have been reported as destroyed so far, and unfortunately, that isn't the worst of it. According to health officials on the ground, only a relatively small proportion of the dead and wounded that have been processed or received so far were men of fighting age. The majority, and by a considerable margin, were women, children, and the elderly. The European hospital, a frequent destination for foreign doctors to do humanitarian work, reported 17 members of a single family killed in the strike, including 8 children. Another family in Gaza City reportedly suffered the deaths of 27 people, of whom Gaza's health ministry reported that over half were women and children. A doctor at another hospital, Tanya Hassan, speaking to the Associated Press, stated of her hospital's patients, quote, "There were probably 3 men, and the rest were all children, women, elderly, everybody caught in their sleep, still wrapped in blankets. Terrifying." End quote. At the time of writing, a majority of Gazan hospitals that are still operational report being overwhelmed by the dead and the wounded. The number of fatalities at the time of writing is 404. The number of wounded has crested above 560. Those numbers will almost certainly continue to rise as rescue operations continue amidst the rubble. Among the deceased is one Essam Aralis, the acting head of the Hamas government across all of Gaza, Ahmed al-Hetta, Gaza's Deputy Minister of Justice, and Mahmoud Abu Wafta, the head of Hamas-led security services within the Gaza Strip. The spokesman of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was also killed. The specific identities of many of the dead are not yet known, but again, the majority appear to have been non-combatants. Also at the time of writing, Israeli officials report that the air campaign is still ongoing and will continue for some time. Again, this episode is up to date only through sundown in Gaza on Tuesday the 18th, and unfortunately we here at WarFronts wouldn't be surprised if there's another ruinous night ahead between the time we write and record this episode, and of course by the time you see it. Parallel to its air campaign, Israel has announced new evacuation orders in Gaza pertaining to basically the outer rim of the territory. A couple of kilometers from the northern border, a kilometer or so from the southern, and 3 to 5 kilometers at various points across the long southeastern border with Israel, pushing Gazan residents toward the territory's center and toward the sea. The IDF emphasized the need to evacuate 2 areas in particular, the northeastern corner of Gaza near the city of Jabalia and a pocket of territory east of Khan Yunis. Israeli tanks have already conducted shelling operations across the Gazan border east of Khan Yunis, with 13 people reported dead in the shelling at this time, again with that number likely to rise. So, that's the situation in Gaza as of now. A full return to Israel's air campaign, a devastating wave of strikes, and an immense death toll that will almost certainly have risen further by the time you see this episode. But just as important as explaining what happened is explaining why it happened. And in this case, that's an answer that we're going to give in 2 parts. First of all, the immediate rationale behind Israel's decision to both launch a strike at all and to launch a strike like this. Now, we'll get into the broader circumstances of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire in just a moment, but for now, suffice it to say that ever since Israel and Hamas completed their long sequence of hostage and prisoner swaps, the ceasefire arrangement has continued on borrowed time. Neither Israel nor Hamas have been able to come to terms around either an extension of the deal or a progression to a new phase of the ceasefire, and that ceasefire was set to expire 1 day after Israel launched its airstrike campaign on March the 19th. Once that happens, neither Israel nor Hamas would have been protected under any truce agreement, and that's a situation that would be problematic no matter who or where we're discussing. The trouble with a truce deal that's set to expire is that each warring side is obviously anticipating that once a truce expires, their enemy will attack. So, each side has an incentive to try and attack first, but they each understand that their adversary has that incentive too, so each side will be attempting to figure out when they stand the best chance at getting the first hit in and hitting their adversary so hard that they won't hit back. And for Israel, that appears to have been the rationale. Said IDF spokesman Nadav Shoshani on the attack, the Israeli military, quote, launched a series of preemptive strikes against Hamas terror targets. According to Shoshani, Israel had reason to believe that, quote, Hamas was actively planning and preparing to carry out further terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians. Israel has yet to produce concrete evidence of an impending attack, but the nation has often made similar claims with little to no publicly disclosed proof, and in any case, Israel's own leaders have indicated that that's only half the story. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explained that the nation had launched its strikes because Hamas had rejected Israel's proposals to extend the ceasefire and repeatedly refused to release the hostages it still holds. Netanyahu stated that, quote, from now on, Israel will act against Hamas with increasing military force, and he expressed that the return of Israeli hostages inside Gaza is a primary objective for the IDF. Said Israel's defense minister, tacking on to the threat of escalation, if Hamas does not release all kidnapped, the gates of hell will open in Gaza, and Hamas's murderers and rapists will meet the IDF with forces they have never known before. We will not stop fighting until all the kidnapped return home and all the war goals are achieved. End quote. The Netanyahu government had reportedly received approval for the strike several days in advance and briefed the Trump administration in the United States, thus obtaining approval from Israel's most important international backer. So, those are the immediate justifications behind Israel's new round of strikes, but it's by winding the clock back a little further that we find the broader circumstances in which Israel chose to act. Since mid-January, all parties have understood that the deal that has governed the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas thus far was due to expire around this time. During that first phase, 38 hostages, including 33 Israelis and 5 Thais, were released from Hamas captivity in exchange for roughly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Despite that success, however, the first phase ceasefire was instituted with the expectation that a second phase agreement would be negotiated during the first phase, and that never happened. In an attempt to force Hamas into terms that Israel finds favorable, Israel has been choking off the supply of all humanitarian aid to Gaza for 2 weeks now. The nation recently shut off the remaining trickle of electricity into the territory, thus deactivating a critical desalination plant that provides drinking water to much of Gaza. Israel has also launched a number of earlier airstrikes, including strikes on March 15th, that purportedly killed several militants, although Hamas disputed that claim and insisted that the dead were a combination of charity workers and Palestinian journalists operating a non-threatening drone. Those applications of pressure by Israel were an attempt to force Hamas to accept its chosen terms for the future, an extension of the first phase of the ceasefire deal in which Hamas would release half its remaining hostages and Israel would make a commitment to negotiating a permanent ceasefire at some time in the future. For reference, Hamas is currently holding 59 hostages, including about 24 who are believed to still be alive, with the remainder being the bodies of hostages who've died in captivity. Hamas had instead been trying to start a second phase of the ceasefire in which Hamas would release all hostages, Israel would withdraw all forces from Gaza, and negotiations would begin toward the establishment of a permanent peace. Over the last several days, however, negotiations deteriorated rapidly between the two sides. An American attempt to consult one-on-one with Hamas yielded no positive results and spiked tensions with Israel in the process, and the United States' subsequent attempt to propose a ceasefire extension has fallen on deaf ears. Seeing Israel's refusal to accept its terms, Hamas attempted to place pressure on Israel by adding terms, including the release of additional Palestinian prisoners and a lift of the blockade around Gaza in exchange for progress toward a second-stage deal. Israel refused to shift its position, and around this time the United States and Israel both began strongly implying that if Hamas failed to accommodate their demands, a return to full-scale violence in Gaza would be imminent. Turning the clock forward, it appears that those threats have now been realized. But there's also another angle to consider on the Israeli side, specifically the personal interests of Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, quite possibly precipitating a quicker return to violence than otherwise would have happened. On the same day as the airstrikes began, Netanyahu himself was scheduled to testify in Jerusalem District Court relating to an ongoing corruption trial against him that's widely regarded as having the potential to end his political career if he's convicted. After the start of the airstrikes that Netanyahu himself ordered across Gaza, he lodged a request to cancel his testimony in court, and that request was granted. Adding to Netanyahu's incentives to launch a strike was a decision Netanyahu made 2 days prior on March 16th to fire the head of the Shin Bet domestic terror organization, Ronen Bar. Shin Bet had opened investigations into wrongdoing by several Netanyahu aides, and Bar had personally served as one of the few voices left in the Israeli government willing to push back against Netanyahu from within his own coalition. Ousting him would be unprecedented, and according to many experts on Israeli law, illegal. Netanyahu will need to seek cabinet approval to finalize Bar's ouster, but the process to do that's already underway, and although Netanyahu faced pushback for the decision prior to the strikes in Gaza, that pushback may begin to disappear. Once opposition leader in Israel, Yair Golan, accused Netanyahu of renewing the campaign in Gaza as a direct attempt to deflect attention from the Ronen Bar firing, a move that would have resulted in mass protests, but now may not. A vote on his ouster is scheduled to happen on Wednesday, possibly before this episode is released. And Netanyahu, by the way, has rejected these accusations. But in fairness, it's not clear anybody expected him to confirm them. So, on the grand scale, we can identify what appear to be 3 separate incentives for Netanyahu and the IDF to have begun these strikes. Those are the perceived threat of an imminent attack against Israel, and we say perceived for reasons that we'll touch on shortly, as well as both a broad desire to force Hamas to accept Israel's negotiating terms and, quite possibly, to save Netanyahu's own skin within Israeli domestic politics. We lay all that context out so that we understand why the world reacted to Israel's strikes the way it did. Because seemingly more so now than ever before, the vast majority of the world has responded to Israel with complete condemnation. There were, of course, a small and predictable handful of positive reactions to Israel's airstrikes on the world stage. America's Trump administration voiced its full support of Israel's actions, with global media reporting that Trump explicitly gave Israel a green light to renew its Gaza operations. Trump and his inner circle have made their own fire and brimstone threats against Hamas in recent weeks, escalating rhetoric they've used for a good deal longer than that. Said the US Deputy Ambassador to the UN during a Security Council meeting, quote, "The blame for the resumption of hostilities lies solely with Hamas. It is the people of Gaza who will suffer further because of Hamas's disregard for human life." A range of conservative and hardline voices in Israel expressed support for the harsh measures that Jerusalem chose, and in fact, it appears that the move will bring some political benefit for Netanyahu, at least in the near term. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the leader of an extreme ultranationalist party, withdrew from and subsequently weakened Netanyahu's political coalition when the ceasefire went into effect. Now, though, he's announced that he and his party will return to the nation's ruling coalition, now that Netanyahu has pursued the intensified military campaign that Ben-Gvir had repeatedly called for. Across the globe, however, praise for Israel seems to have ended there. Longtime allies of Israel lambasted the renewal of its airstrike campaign, with France condemning Israel for, quote, numerous civilian casualties and, quoting again, compromising efforts to free hostages, while the UK described the strikes as, quote, appalling. The UK and France both urged a return to dialogue immediately, although the British government did rebuke its own Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, after Lammy stated that Israel's strikes had violated international law. While China, in its usual fashion, avoided taking a hard stance by way of condemnation, the nation urged against future escalation, while Russia issued warnings over the risk of a, quote, spiral of escalation. The United Nations, an organization that the Netanyahu government has increasingly framed as an opponent, levied criticism against the strikes via several officers at once. The Gaza-based humanitarian director of the organization, Save the Children, called the strikes and the collapse of the ceasefire, quote, nothing short of a death sentence for Gaza's children. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia called for an immediate halt to the fighting and condemned the attacks, quote, in the strongest terms. Both of the nations that joined the US in mediating the ceasefire deal, Egypt and Qatar, expressed similar frustrations. Egypt called the attack a, quote, flagrant violation of the ceasefire and insisted that it constitutes a, quote, dangerous escalation which threatens to bring about serious consequences for the stability of the region, while Qatar attempted to explain that Israel's, quote, escalating policies will ultimately ignite the region. Turkey, a regional power in the Middle East, called Israel's attacks, quote, a new phase in its policy of genocide, and Turkish leader Erdogan personally referred to Israel as a, quote, terrorist state. Jordan, long a collaborator with Israel on security matters, called the bombing, quote, aggressive and barbaric. The responses that nations like Iran or organizations like Hezbollah offered, we assume you can imagine, although we'll illustrate one in particular. Yemen's Houthi rebels, who halted their campaign against Red Sea shipping traffic when Israel and Hamas entered a ceasefire, vowed to reopen hostilities in solidarity with Gaza. At the time of writing, at least one projectile has been intercepted en route to Israel. Hezbollah and Iran, in an unusual contrast, did not vow any retributive violence. And within Israel, the harshest criticism of all came from the organizations that have made it their mission to advocate for a safe return of the hostages still in Hamas captivity, the very people who Netanyahu claimed were the government's top priority. Said a statement by the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, a primary group that advocates for hostages and their families, quote, the greatest fear of the families, the hostages, and the citizens has come true. The Israeli government has chosen to abandon the hostages. We are shocked, outraged, and deeply concerned by the deliberate destruction of the process to bring back our loved ones. The forum, along with other hostage advocacy groups, have insisted, in the wake of the strikes, that it is Netanyahu's renewal of violence that will lead the remaining living hostages to be killed when they otherwise could have been freed peacefully. Several former hostages have taken to social media to directly protest the government's actions, one of whom, Omar Wenkert, wrote, quote, returning to fighting, did you listen to a word of what we, the returnees released in the last deal, have been saying to you? Did you see us? The sense of being forsaken is the strongest I have ever felt. Israelis have now begun to rally en masse in Tel Aviv at the time of writing, expressing a profound concern that Hamas will seek to punish Israel with the only leverage it still has, executing those hostages who remain when faced with an adversary whose actions seem to prove that a ceasefire is no longer of interest. Wrote the Hostages and Missing Families Forum on X, we are shocked, angry, and terrified by the deliberate dismantling of the process to return our loved ones from the terrible captivity of Hamas. But perhaps the most stunning statement of all was what the Hamas organization didn't say or do in the aftermath of the strikes. As of the end of the day, Tuesday, Hamas has not engaged in any known attempt to launch a counterattack of any kind and has yet to take any observable action at all via its military wing. No rockets have been set off toward IDF positions or Israeli civilians. There have been no attempts to start firefights or sow chaos, and there haven't even been attacks from other militant groups in Gaza like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hamas has issued condemnations in response to the attack, with officials accusing Israel of basically terminating the ceasefire in Gaza unilaterally and stating in regard to Israeli hostages that the nation's airstrikes were, quote, a decision to sacrifice the occupation's prisoners and impose a death sentence on them. Yet substantive retaliation still hasn't come, and in fact Hamas has indicated that it's going to try and wait to restart the ceasefire deal if there's a way to do so. Certainly, it's worth noting that for Hamas, there's real benefit in sitting back and letting the international community condemn Israel, as it's been doing, with those condemnations possibly growing even sharper when Hamas does nothing in return. But whether it's an attempt to manipulate the moment or not, it is a stark departure from Hamas's approach in earlier phases of the conflict, and it may create a meaningful shift in each side's negotiating posture in any subsequent attempts to work toward a truce. It's also a grim reminder that the way Hamas can harm Israel the most isn't by launching rockets or skirmishing with IDF troops, it's by taking action against the 20-odd living hostages still in captivity. Israel has yet to lay out a precise plan to express precisely where the nation will go from here, but at the very least, a few next steps appear likely. In accordance with the forced evacuations that Israel has already ordered for much of the Gaza Strip, it appears that ground operations will likely resume soon, or may have resumed by the time you see this episode. Those ground operations will likely involve the use of tank columns and may attempt ingress at those 2 evacuation zones we mentioned earlier, one in Gaza's northeast corner and the other located east of Khan Yunis. The evacuation orders that Israel has sent out thus far suggest that operations will take place near Gaza's border perimeter, possibly to clear those areas out or possibly to advance IDF troops and begin to squeeze the Gazan population into the middle of the territory, backed up against the sea. Over the ceasefire period, Israel rested its troops, replenished munitions, repaired equipment, and is otherwise made ready for a large-scale offensive. Meanwhile, air operations appear set to continue for quite a while, and if Israel showed such blatant disregard for civilian casualties in its first round assault, then it stands to reason that subsequent rounds of airstrikes, now that Israel and the global public are accustomed to the death toll, will be just as indiscriminate, or even more so. With regard to the hostages, quite frankly, it is very difficult to be optimistic as the hostage families and advocacy groups have led the way in expressing. Again, Hamas does not appear to have attempted any retaliation at this time, but it is worth repeating that the retaliation that would both be most meaningful to the people of Israel and easiest for Hamas to achieve would be to go to the remaining hostages in dark tunnels and cells where they're already under Hamas's complete control and end their lives. Israel's continued interest in recovering the bodies of deceased hostages proves that Hamas will still retain some form of bargaining chip, even if it takes that action. Obviously, it's our hope that the hostages, just like every non-combatant in Israel and every non-combatant in Gaza, remains unharmed. But right now, that does not seem to be a realistic expectation. Quite frankly, the hostages could already be gone. The biggest question of all is the question of just what the Israeli government is going to do from here. On the one hand, it's not unreasonable to wonder whether Netanyahu and his coalition have overplayed their hand, throwing away any remaining patience from the nations of the Middle East, from the wider world, or from even the families of hostages who wield considerable persuasive power toward the Israeli public if they choose to use it. On the other, Netanyahu could just as easily be in a position of strength. His coalition has been strengthened, he's dodged his corruption trial another day, and he appears to have quite literal unconditional support from the only ally that Netanyahu can't survive without, in the United States of America. What Netanyahu has done is a clear attempt to brute force Israel's way through a tricky moment. But that begs the question, might Netanyahu have the brute force at his disposal to do it? Whatever the answer may be, the situation now is clear. The Gaza Strip will return to war. It already has returned to war. And the prospect that the Israeli government will choose to restrain itself now is vanishingly remote. As we write this, it hasn't yet been a day since hostilities resumed, and yet we suspect that the death toll of these last 24 hours will ultimately crest past 500 and probably higher. If this is day one of the renewed conflict, then it is frightening to imagine what will come on day 2 and on every day thereafter. Thank you for watching.